Dr. Katy Highet. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to our Open Discourse.net seminar. Katy is a lecturer in English language and TESOL at the University of the West of Scotland, and she's currently working on a Carnegie Trust Fund project on anti-racist and anti-fascist activism in education. She was previously an ESRC postdoctoral fellow at UCL in London at the Institute of Education, where she also completed her PhD. Before this, she worked as a language teacher in Gujarat, India, for several years. As a critical sociolinguist, her ethnographic work focuses on language, the political economy, and activism in India and in the UK. Her work has been published in, among other venues, the Journal of Linguistic Anthropology, the Journal of Sociolinguistics, for which she also works as a book reviews editor and social media editor, the International Journal of the Sociology of Language and Communication. And I'm excited to say that both Katy and I are also currently working together on an edited volume on transnational Hindu nationalism to be published with Edinburgh University Press. And her talk today will also address the phenomenon of Hindutva, or far-right Hindu fascism, and in particular, she will critically investigate Hindu nationalist co-optations of decoloniality. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Katy Highet to the Open Discourse.net Seminar London. Katy, the floor is all yours. We're excited about your talk.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jaspal, and thanks everyone else for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm just gonna check that my screen is sharing properly. Are you able to see my slideshow?
Not full screen yet.
Can you see the full screen now?
No.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, and you can't see anything else on my screen?
No.
Lovely. All right. Well, thank you very much. So first of all, yeah, thanks very much for the invitation to be here today. It's nice to see some familiar faces, but also a lot of new ones, and hopefully I'll see the other faces of everyone once you are allowed to turn your cameras on later. As Jaspal said, I'm going to be talking today about the co-optation of decolonial discourses by the Hindu nationalist movement, and particularly how this is enacted through the Indian diaspora. And if you're not super familiar with Hindu nationalism, or Hindutva, as it's also known, well, first of all, lucky you. And secondly, don't worry, I'm going to come back to it a bit later on. But this phenomenon, this kind of co-optation of decoloniality by Hindutva, that I'm going to be looking at in this talk, it's not brand new. In fact, we've kind of noticed this happening for the last decade, and particularly over the last 5 or 6 years, so kind of predominantly from the second term of the Hindu Nationalist Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and it's something that has really come increasingly to the attention of those who are watching with concern the strategies of the Hindutva machine. And I first noticed it myself at the end of a previous project about the politics of English in India, but it really came to my attention in 2021 when I stumbled across this opinion article, which, as you can see on the screen, is entitled "Comparative Linguistics has unsavory roots, here's why." And as you can see from the extracts on the screen, in the text, the author, someone called Avatans Kumar, he offers a brief historical overview of what he refers to as the emergence of racism in the humanities, with a particular reference to the role of disciplines like linguistics, anthropology, and Indology. And in the text, he kind of primarily draws on a review that was written in 2013 by Vishwa Adlori and Joydeep Bagchi of Rabao Ferhan's book, Archives of Origins. And this review critiques the classification of superior and inferior languages by 19th century philologists. And in the text, he argues that this line of thinking allowed Europeans to spread colonialism through Asia, Africa, and the Americas. And in the part of the text that you can see and in the text more generally, there's nothing particularly novel or controversial about the argument that he puts forward. And I certainly don't disagree with the surface claims. You know, as we all know here, the relationship between linguistics, race science, and colonialism, you know, is something that has been the subject of a lot of post and decolonial critique for a long while. And we know that this work has also really heavily influenced critical socio-historical perspectives in sociolinguistics and discourse studies and linguistic anthropology, you know, which have all of this work has kind of done that work of tracing the production and circulation of knowledge within our very fields and the consequences of this on social processes of categorization and valuation and hierarchization. So on the surface, nothing in this article is particularly noteworthy in that regard. But what did concern me was where and by whom these decolonial critiques were being promoted, and in particular, for what purpose. So Kumar's article was published in the online news portal of this Indian magazine, Swarajya, which means self-rule in Hindi. It was originally founded in 1956. The magazine describes itself as, and I quote, a big tent for liberal right of centre discourse that reaches out, engages, and caters to the new India. But it's also really well known for its misinformation. So Swarajya is currently blacklisted on Wikipedia, for example. It's also very well known for its vocal support of the Hindu Nationalist Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his party, the BJP. And in fact, the magazine actually originally closed down in 1980 and then relaunched again in 2014, just a few months after Modi was elected for his first term, which is hardly a coincidence, I would suggest. And the opinion piece itself was written by a self-proclaimed Hindutva or Hindu nationalist supporter. He's a diasporic Indian who now resides in the US, where he obtained a graduate degree in linguistics and from where he now writes like prolifically. And across his many opinion pieces, Kumar certainly doesn't shy away from his Hindu nationalist sentiment with articles such as this one entitled, for the Times of India, entitled Hindutva is the essence of my existence as a Hindu. I challenge you to dismantle me. And we'll see a little bit later why this particular phrasing of dismantling is really important here. And so basically, the more I started reading of Kumar's work, the more alarmed I grew to see how these kind of decolonial critiques of Orientalism and colonial knowledge production were being repurposed to support and justify the creation of an exclusionary Hindu nationalist state. So what is Hindu nationalism or Hindutva? There's a long history to Hindu nationalism. It dates back well over 100 years. It's certainly not a new phenomenon, but what is perhaps new is the speed and the vigor with which it's been gaining traction over the last few decades, as it has been kind of re-energized under the leadership of Narendra Modi, and exacerbated by India's neoliberal restructuring since the 1990s. And since Modi came to power in 2014, the BJP, his party, and its associated organization, the RSS, have increasingly attempted to shape India along Hindutva lines. And this has materialized in lots of different ways. So through, you know, their tacit and also vocal support for vigilante action fueled by Islamophobic conspiracy theories around so-called love jihad, through outright denials of caste inequality, combined with a complete disavowal of the reservation system, through the rewriting of history, through national curriculum reform and textbook updates, and attempts to reinstate Sanskrit, to reduce English language education, and to purify Hindi of English and importantly Urdu influences as well. And so at its core, Hindutva is a political imaginary which is grounded in a narrative that envisages India as fundamentally a Hindu nation which is under threat, and which seeks to, in Jaspal Singh's words, protect the Hindu way of life against outside forces. And so in this narrative, Muslims, Christians, atheists, but also Marxists, Dalits, feminists, and so on, they become outsiders, right? A threat to the nation and to the state. And any attempt to critique the state is met with both symbolic and real violence. And so the Hindutva narrative kind of crafts itself as protecting the nation from both internal and external threats, and as reconnecting Hindu India with roots that have been strangled through colonial iterations. And it's precisely in that retelling that the language of decolonization gets taken up and repurposed or hijacked, to use Shah's terms, to reframe the brutality of Hindutva as this kind of righteous decolonial pursuit. And so this pseudo-decolonisation discourse, as Sayan Day calls it, which is promoted by the BJP and their advocates, has been quite widely documented over the last couple of years in tandem with its increasing appropriation by Hindutva scholars and activists throughout academic publishing and wider media, both in India and in the diaspora. So what I hope to do in this talk and in the paper that it's based on is to kind of build on this previous work in order to look at how these decolonial registers circulate and how they get mobilized by Hindutva actors in transnational academic spaces. And using Susan Gall's concept of grafting, what I'm interested in is how these registers are adapted and expanded by well-connected diasporic networks, and how they kind of get melded with other localized discourses and registers to kind of boost their authority. But before I jump right into that, I want to think a little bit more about the decolonial register more generally. So, I mean, decolonial has become somewhat of a buzzword in academic circles over the last decade. It was initially kind of propelled into mainstream academia following the student-led movements, such as the Rhodes Must Fall campaign that you can see on the screen. But since then, decolonizing has been transformed into, in Priya Gopal's words, acceptable institutional jargon, with university administrations seemingly open to putting it down as an action point on the managerial agenda. But of course, while its kind of current popular iteration in a lot of academic scholarship is often this kind of toothless critique, the origins of the movement were obviously much more embedded in anti-colonial struggle, particularly, those of Latin America through the work of Quijano, and in the French colonies through, for example, the work of Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire, and with an emphasis on what Lewis and Lau call the redistribution and restructuring of social, political, and economic systems. The decolonial school distinguishes itself from the post-colonial and its more kind of post-structuralist focus on the discursive. But despite the fact that decolonial tends to have this kind of more trenchant critique of capitalism and colonial extraction, there are still a lot of critiques of the decolonial field, including, for example, the erasure of women and practices of gatekeeping. And in India specifically, further critiques have been made within the academic field of decolonization, of a lack of attention being paid to caste, for example, as an analytical category, as well as the dominance in this space of English-speaking upper caste elites. So basically, the point I'm trying to make is that the decolonial is already this kind of really highly contested register, which has diverging histories and multiple avatars. But as I've already alluded to, its most concerning metamorphosis is this more recent co-optation by the Hindu far right. And so the decolonial has become a key part of how Hindu nationalism kind of articulates itself. And as I said before, at its core, this Hindutva imaginary, particularly the one that is promoted by the BJP, it's built upon a retelling of Indian history, which, to quote Menon, places Hinduism as the original civilization on the Indian subcontinent, a civilization that has been plundered by various foreign invasions. And so through this story, what we have on the one hand is India's kind of Hindu ancient civilization gets positioned in opposition to the lingering structures and systems of British colonialism and to Western ideology. But on the other hand, and as we can see on the slide here from this example from Amit Shah, who is Narendra Modi's right-hand man, Hindutva also presents itself as an ethno-nation that has been subjugated and continues to be subjugated by Muslim invaders. And so by positing the Hindu-Indian struggle as one that is being led against both British or Western and Muslim oppressors, the decolonial movement for Hindutva supporters becomes one of reinstating what Menon calls the indigenous Bharatiya consciousness. Bharatiya meaning Bharat, which is the sort of Sanskrit or pre-colonial name for India, which is kind of having a bit of a resurgence. And so the consequences of this co-optation of decoloniality and indeed indigeneity are twofold, right? It does two things. It firstly draws clear boundaries around who can lay claim to Indian indigeneity, in other words, caste Hindus. And secondly, it kind of justifies the marginalization of and the violence towards anything which is un-Indian or un-Hindu, right? So primarily, but not exclusively, Indian Muslims. But importantly, these efforts to kind of indigenize and decolonize, they're not only rhetorical and they're not just confined to political discourse. They've been accompanied by material changes, through the rewriting of school curricula, the appointment of Hindutva advocates as heads of universities, the funding of Indic research centers for Sanskrit and yoga, and soft power means such as Bollywood, and this kind of ideological reshaping of Indian history of culture is what Sayan Day calls a kind of selective endeavor of erasure and distortions, and kind of touches all arenas of activity in India, way beyond just the educational. We can think about, for example, the inauguration of the Ram Temple in Ayodhya, or here, as you see on the screen, the removal of Muslim names from streets, institutions, and even cities. But this reshaping of this retelling of Indian history is also one that completely masks its authoritarian, exclusionary, and quite violent agenda, precisely by making these kind of claims to righteous justice through its linking to the decolonial movement. And what many people, including myself, have argued is that this is just not decoloniality, right? This is a reductive re-semiotization of the decolonial that is being used to justify an ethno-nationalist state. And so to think about what is happening here, I found it really useful to think in terms of register grafting. So if we think of speech registers as being these kind of assembled, typified, multimodal features of communicative display that are linked to particular sets of characteristics, activities, practices, and values, in Susan Gall's terms, we know that these assembled communicative forms can become identifiable as a kind of coherent set, a register that categorizes the people who use it, and then can be kind of mobilized and taken up and recognized as such. But what this also means is that they're available for what Gall calls grafting, right? So in her writing on the social organization of interdiscursivity, she describes grafting as the implantation of registers indexical of one social arena into opposing arenas. So basically taking registers that are associated with a progressive movement, for example, and mobilizing them within repressive movements. And Susan Gall provides the example of the discursive construction of gender equality or genderism in Poland and Hungary as being these kind of Western colonial imports. And she demonstrates how through their use of anti-colonial discourses, defeating genderism becomes legitimized as resistance, right? So this kind of grafting allows actors to capture authority from anti-colonial tropes and language and repurpose them for regressive authoritarian means. And so I'm arguing that similarly, by borrowing the language of decoloniality and indigeneity, Hindutva's cultural nationalism is lent a legitimizing facade that masks its violent marginalization and its oppression of ostensible threats. And as many have documented, we've been seeing this happen more and more over the last decade as decoloniality and indigeneity have been widely appropriated by Modi's government to justify the exclusionary ideals and practices of a Hindu ethno-state. But while there's no shortage of decolonial claims by the BJP itself, the decolonial register has also been taken up by actors across arenas that extend beyond party politics and national borders. And the examples that I'm going to show today are kind of indicative of how the decolonial register sort of bleeds across more or less discrete spaces. And I think what this underscores is this process of interdiscursivity, right? How registers are formed and circulated, contested and changed as they get mobilized across distinct areas of social action. And this allows us to see how with each contextualized uptake, registers take on what Tabaldi and Baran describe as new semiotic and ideological elements in different local contexts. And so in the next part of the talk, I'm going to focus on one key site or arena of social action to tease out the kind of circulation uptake and consequences of this shifting decolonial register. I'm going to focus in particular on Hindu nationalist diaspora actors in the US who both kind of echo the Hindutva decolonial narrative the narrative which is dominant in India, but at the same time they transform it by linking it with other discourses that are rooted more firmly in the local context, and thereby they register kind of diaspora specific Hindutva decolonial registers. And I'm particularly interested in the diaspora as an integral space within the wider Hindu national imaginary, because even if diaspora making has always been kind of crucial to the construction of the Indian nation, there has been this more concerted effort to develop what Menon call the permanent bond since the rise of the BJP, with more recent efforts focusing on diasporic youth by leveraging what again Menon call the diasporic anxiety embodied within second and third generation Indians. And crucially, these diaspora making networks, which are developed and sustained through very sophisticated and expansive use of digital media platforms and tactics, they represent the extension of Hindu nationalism and in its mainstreaming. And so what we can see in the diaspora space is not only how Hindu nationalism is engaged with, but also how it gets repurposed or rearticulated for Western diasporic societies. And as Colin Menon have argued, this has the consequence of both enabling global support for Modi and also of redefining or attempting to redefine the Indian diaspora as a Hindu bloc. So who are these kind of diaspora actors who are enabling and circulating Hindu nationalism? Well, there are many, but I'm going to focus specifically today on this kind of network of academics and students as kind of key actors in this transnational space. And while it's important to emphasize, obviously, that not every student member of groups such as the Hindu Students' Council in the US would espouse Hindutva views, these kind of societies are bolstered by a network of highly active Hindutva actors. And one of the most prominent is someone called Rajiv Malhotra. He's an Indian academic who now resides in the US. You can sort of see him on the screen, this guy on the far right there, physically and politically. He lives in the US now. He's the founder of something called the Infinity Foundation and author of books such as Academic Hinduphobia, which I'll come back to later. Malhotra was the keynote speaker at the Hindu Students' Council conference of 2020, and with a YouTube channel, which is what you can see on the screen now, which boasts over 585,000 subscribers. He is explicitly invested in kind of inducting new generations of Hindu Indian diaspora into the Hindutva imaginary. And you can see that on the screen, right? Look up in his descriptions of the aim of the channel and what he's seeking to do, right? Training young scholars. And a big part of his activism takes the form of university campus lectures in the US, but also in the UK, which he also publishes on his YouTube channel. And much like in the text that I discussed at the beginning of the talk, many of these lectures draw on decolonial critiques of exoticization and extractivist practices of colonial anthropology and Indology. But as Menon has written, in a lot of Malhotra's work, he conflates the Indian nation state and civilization as one. And in doing this, I quote, he lends support to the Hindutva narrative of a homogenous Hindu past disrupted by foreign intervention. So that's the kind of story he's invested in. And so much like we see in the BJP's crafting of the discourse, there's this kind of masked slippage between decolonization and cultural nationalism as the kind of critiques and language and methods of decolonial studies are used to justify Hindu nationalism. But what's particularly interesting about Malhotra is how, differently to what we see happening within India, the decolonial register that he mobilizes gets linked in these diasporic spaces with another related term, which is Hinduphobia. And Malhotra himself claims credit for popularizing and even coining the term, which he describes as meaning the hateful demonization of Hindus. I think it's really important to consider what the mobilization of this term does, right? So first of all, we can see how Hinduphobia relies upon what Susan Gall calls grafting, right? Borrowing authority from other registers that circulate prominently in diaspora spaces in the West. And most obviously here, it's Hinduphobia's mimicry of Islamophobia, right? A term that is heavily informed by post and decolonial perspectives, and particularly through critiques of Orientalism, and through the linguistic equivalence that is suggested through the coinage. Malhotra and others kind of analogize the systemic racialization and oppression of Muslims, and they transfer this to the Hindu community. I don't have time to go into in detail, but if anyone's interested in a kind of extended argument of why this is a false equivalence, there's two texts in my reference list I'd recommend, Patel and Sundaram. But in practice, what this term does is conflate the very real and the very violent racism towards Indians or towards South Asians with a historical systemic discrimination of Hindus. And with the likes of Malhotra and his supporters, they find this evidence of Hindu persecution along two lines of argument. And in the first, they draw on the long list of atrocious attacks on Indian Hindus in the West. But they find the motivation in these attacks not in structural racism, but in specifically Hinduphobia. But when they do this, their arguments tend to undo themselves. So if we consider as an example here the history of anti-Hindu bias and Hinduphobia in the United States, this is an online article written by the Hindu American Foundation, which is a pretty key actor in the Hindutva movement. And in this article, the HAF notes the numerous tragic murders of Hindus and attacks on Hindus in the US that followed September 11th, 2001. But while the article claims to provide evidence of the targeting of Hindus as Hindus, it entangles itself in this contradiction by stating that attacks in this period were, and I quote, part of a backlash from the attacks targeting Arab and Muslim Americans and those who could be mistaken for such, which is actually quite an odd admission, right? It's considering the argument they're trying to develop in this article, it's an odd admission to basically say that on many occasions, attacks on Hindus were actually committed because they were assumed to be Muslim. But what we can kind of take from this line of argument is how Hindutva actors are able to kind of discursively separate out attacks on Hindus from the larger question of structural racism as the primary motivator for attacks. And simultaneously, they kind of distinguish themselves from Muslims while also legitimizing their claims of persecution through this kind of analogous troping on Islamophobia. But there's a second consequence of this mobilization of Hinduphobia in the diaspora, and that's how it is used to recategorize any backlash to the Hindutva project as evidence of Hindu phobia. And by conflating Hindu nationalism and Hinduism, critiques of Hindutva as a far-right ethno-nationalist project become attacks on Hindus, and therefore they get reformulated as evidence of the systemic marginalization and persecution of Hindus. And in particular, Indians or those of Indian heritage who engage in critique of Hindu nationalism are particularly attacked by Rajiv Malhotra and get termed by him as, and I quote, Indian sepoys in collusion with their Western masters who hate their own heritage and would like the racist Western scholars to enter and rescue the Indian masses, right? So he kind of re-contextualizes these kind of colonial terms like sepoy, but also you kind of see like coolies up here, right? But sepoy was used to refer to Indian soldiers who served in the armies of the British and Mughal empires. So by doing this, Malhotra is able to kind of reframe any critique of Hindutva or Hinduism by Indians as a kind of evidence of their colonial mindset, right? It's a colonial move to critique India. And it's something which is in this line of argument rooted in a systemic colonial practice of hatred towards Hindus. And so Hinduphobia becomes a product of colonialism, and challenging Hinduphobia becomes the decolonial move. And as Hindus for Human Rights have argued, this has really powerful effects, because these accusations of Hinduphobia are used to silence critics and to defend their own physical and discursive attacks. And this was probably best exemplified in the response to the dismantling global Hindutva conference. We know that term dismantling that we saw from Avatans Kumar at the beginning. This was hosted online by Johns Hopkins University in September 2021, and it sought to, quote, highlight the transnational and global implications of Hindutva given its growing reach in the Indian diaspora. And the conference came under massive attack. In the run-up to the event, a mass complaint letter writing campaign that was coordinated by the Hindu American Foundation and the Coalition of Hindus of North America crashed university servers. Participants and organizers of the conference received countless death and bomb threats, and with accusations of the conference being Hinduphobic and therefore threatening the safety of Hindu students. And in an article written after the event, Deepa Sundaram, who was one of the coordinators, highlighted how this conference marked an evolution of tactics for the Hindutva diaspora. She wrote, "The transnational and coordinated attacks on the conference, its organizers and participants offer insight into important changes in how US-based Hindutva groups are co-opting and instrumentalizing student voices, among others. Specifically, this assault traded on anti-racist rhetoric, seizing upon the real harms that South Asians have faced under white supremacy and deliberately misconstruing these as a broader systemic assault against Hindus, i.e. Hinduphobia, to advance the key Hindutva goal of muzzling criticism in the North American Academy." I think there's a couple of things we can emphasize here. First of all, we see how this Hinduphobia discourse works to kind of invisibilize its own violence against critics. And this violence is coordinated on a global scale, and it's certainly not restricted to this conference alone, and so it's able at once to cause real material and symbolic harm to its detractors, while also reframing this violence as a justifiable, righteous response to persecution. But secondly, what is, I think, really important here in terms of understanding how this mobilizes students in the diaspora is how it aligns itself with this anti-racist decolonial rhetoric, which offers, as again Sundaram writes, a script to students already invested in racial and gender equity social movements who would be moved by this argument that a conference inspires hatred towards Hindus. And indeed, it would appear that many have been moved by this kind of pseudo social justice register, both students and beyond, you know, from Keir Starmer's denouncement of Hinduphobia following the riots in Leicester in 2023, and the much mediatized Hinduphobia case of Rashmi Samant at Oxford University a couple of years ago, but also the more recent anti-Hinduphobia bill in Georgia, all of these kind of indicating how this Hinduphobia register is kind of gathering speed. And so what we see then is how through these kind of the activities of people such as Malhotra, this Hindutva decolonial register gets attached to an ideological cluster of coded elements that align with the mainstream Hindutva narrative, but which actually take their meaning from their interaction with other circulating registers in the context of the Indian diasporas of the West. And in particular, this concept of Hinduphobia acts as a means of rendering the Hindutva decolonial narrative intelligible, right? Making it alluring and meaningful for a diasporic audience. And this distorted kind of borrowing from left-wing political and academic discourse and frameworks, it silences critique as evidence of colonial mindsets and of Hinduphobia, and at the same time, it kind of justifies the violence of Hindutva activists. It justifies this violence as being simply the legitimate actions of a group that had been systemically, religiously oppressed. And so, through Hinduphobia, Hindutva shifts from being a politically dominant, oppressive regime to a righteous struggle for freedom of the oppressed, with Rajiv Malhotra himself being, in his own words, the man behind the thought revolution. So what can this the Hindutva decolonial register tell us then about far-right co-optations of progressive discourse and language, and perhaps more importantly, how do we respond? I think in the first instance, we see how this kind of Hindutva co-opted decolonial register, in Tibaldi and Baran's words, is both affective and effective, right? It does things. And in the diaspora, the mobilization of this register and its clustering with other grafted terms like Hinduphobia, it works to effectively draw in some diaspora students through its claims to kind of social justice, while being a distinctly kind of supremacist and oppressive practice. And it's a clever move, right? It's one that shifts the enablers of Islamophobic violence into the position of the oppressed, which also at the same time reaches out to the UK and the US's own brands of Islamophobia, right? And through this, the Hinduphobia narrative takes on a particular salience for a diasporic audience, acting as a relay, in Susan Gall's terms, to kind of seamlessly circulate the register to wider arenas of global social practices. But secondly, I think it also raises important questions for the decolonial register besides its co-optation by the far right. I don't think it's enough to naively argue for a reclaiming of the decolonial. As we saw before, the decolonial is already a contested register. It's one whose circulation and uptake in neoliberal academia has been fiercely critiqued. And I think it's worth asking what the co-optation of this register tells us about the decolonial itself. And in a paper from 2023, Anandrup Sen takes aim at what he calls, I quote, the intellectual sloth of the decolonial, which traffics in authenticities and distributes, quote, decolonial templates to consumers of incorruptible identity myths. And I've put this interview up on the screen because I think that sort of perfectly illustrates Sen's arguments here. And what Sen is essentially asking is whether we can truly describe these mutations as a co-optation of liberatory politics by the Hindu far right, or whether they are, and I quote, part of the very internal architecture of this intellectual movement. And so I think what Sen is suggesting is how it is precisely the very transformation of the decolonial register that kind of forces us to return the gaze back onto the register from which it grafted, and to ask how prior uptakes and articulations of the register may have played a significant role in making this far-right co-optation possible to begin with. So I will leave it there. I've got my references here. If anyone wants the PowerPoint, just let me know and I can email it to you. And so as not to end on a totally bleak note, so an example here of how the progressive Hindu diaspora is fighting against these attempts to kind of co-opt the social justice movements. Hindus for Human Rights is a very cool organization that kind of actively resists this conflation of Hinduism and Hindu nationalism. So thanks very much for listening. There's a couple of upcoming papers that I have on the right here if anyone would like a copy of them, just drop me an email and I will stop there.